All right. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Lynn O'Hara from National History Day, and we're thrilled to be with you for the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources Historical Argumentation webinar series number 3. So, first off, I'd like to introduce you to Krista Gredzovich. Krista has joined us on the team at NHD and is part of the programs team. So, welcome, Krista.
Hi, everyone. I have posted a bit in your Google Classrooms, but just a reminder that if you have any questions at all or would like just an ear, someone to talk something through, you can email me. I'm always so happy to meet with you and to talk about your emerging projects.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to have her and to have her jumping on live to join us. All right, webinar number 3. Let's go. A couple things in terms of housekeeping. As you can see, live captioning is turned on. If it bothers you, turn it off. If it's helpful, turn it on. Remember, too, that it is AI generated and isn't perfect. And if it says the wrong word, sorry, we're doing our best here. Housekeeping details, just like before, you've got access to that Q&A box. Krista's going to be in charge of that. So if you've got questions or thoughts, feel free to pop them in there. Like always, we're happy to stay and take questions at the end. We'll post the video tomorrow up to YouTube and get the slides out on Google Classroom. So if there's stuff that you want, let us know, but you'll have access to it in the morning. All right, so our goal today is to get you set up to wrap the draft of your argumentation plan. That's going to be due because of the holiday at noon on the Monday after. So here's the key. If you're going on one of these crazy, wonderful adventures, please finish it this weekend, turn it in. You will be very grateful for that. The model that I'm going to work with tonight on using the topic of women's suffrage is posted in Module 3. These are just some really cool sources that you can use, but also there's a sample argumentation plan. So I did a model of what we're asking you to do, and we've got that there because I think it's sometimes helpful to see a finished product or an exemplar. Obviously, you're doing Kansas, Nebraska, or the Johnstown flood. This is a different topic, but it's still a model to work with. And our last module, Module 4, will launch the same day that Module 3 closes, as always. As Krista mentioned, we have open office hours. We've got one tomorrow, and we've got 2 more that we just scheduled into Module 4. We'll post the dates and the links and all the good stuff in Google Classroom. But please, if you're starting to get frustrated or feel like you want to quit, please don't. Please reach out. Email Krista. She will work out. She's very good with working out the times and the scheduling magic. And trust me, if Krista can't meet with you, I can meet with you. If I can't meet with you, we've got 8 amazing facilitators who are happy to meet with you. And heck, we'll have Christopher come and meet with you if that's what we need to do. We're happy to do it. So stick there with us. We are so close to the end. All right. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Christopher. We're going to do a little bit of a split tonight. And we have our polls ready, so make sure you're ready when they come up. So thanks, Christopher. And you are muted. Has to be at least once, right?
Yeah, it's like my first time on Zoom. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. We know that this is coming to the really busy part of the first half of the school year, and we're really grateful that you're along on the ride with us. We spent the first webinar talking about the suite of historical thinking skills, which are hopefully starting to become really second nature to you. And we spent the second webinar talking about the kind of interpretive tools that historians use as they're trying to make sense of groups of sources. If we're thinking about the webinar series as a whole, as explaining the process by which primary sources become turned into finished historical arguments, then I think the first half of our discussion, webinars 1 and 2, we're really focusing on the left side of the equation, the raw material. The second half of the series, tonight's webinar and the webinar in December, are going to focus more on the finished product and some kind of nuts and bolts stuff after you've done the thinking about primary sources, how you start outlining and writing them up for an audience. That's the process of historical interpretation, right? Taking individual primary sources, assembling them into groups, and then using them to tell a story or make an argument. Because as everyone in the webinar knows, that doesn't happen naturally. It's the thing that we as historians bring to the evidence. We're always focused on cause and effect, and that was a big part of webinar 2, trying to use this mini toolkit to give us some insights into the stories or meaning that might be hidden in a particular set of primary sources. Many of you are, encountering, some minor or maybe moderate frustration and just kind of wrapping your heads around this. And that's completely normal. I feel this frustration, and I've been doing this for a long, long time. You may be experiencing a little bit of frustration with the nomenclature, or a little bit of frustration about the concepts themselves. And it gets easier with practice. I'm always trying to give my students new ways to think about the same things, in the hope that something is going to, hit that student in the right way to make the mystery open up. I know some of you in the second module were encountering kind of curiosity or questions about the idea of agency, this idea of power or influence or leverage, the ability to make consequential decisions. One of the things when I'm working and trying to get a better sense on agency in a particular moment or a particular episode is just to think about, who or what seems to be making the thing I'm thinking about happen. And this is a great way not just to think about National History Day projects or the past, but also think about current events. We see all sorts of examples in daily life about agency, claims about power, claims about leverage, claims about credit, who made this happen, or sometimes claims about blame, who is responsible for this. We saw one play out pretty recently in the headlines last month, when the then Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, was unceremoniously dumped from his post after, I think, about 9 months of tenure. And who or what made that happen? Well, opinions varied. So the Wall Street Journal had this headline that Matt Gaetz tore the House GOP apart and he isn't sorry. And another way to think about that headline is a claim about agency, that Matt Gaetz, the Florida representative, is the person who made this thing happen and who wants the credit for vacating the speaker's chair. But there's other claims about who or what made that happen. So the National Republican Congressional Committee, just a few days after McCarthy was tossed out of the chairship, published this statement that Democrats voted en masse following their extreme leader, Hakeem Jeffries, to throw the House into chaos on a motion to vacate, which is a really different claim. Not that a Republican from Florida caused this to happen, but that it was actually the opposing party that caused it to happen. And that's a different claim about agency. And in this case, it seems like it's an effort to maybe deflect some of the blame for the ensuing chaos, that the NRCC wants not to take credit for this, but to pin the blame on the opposing party. And this, to me, is you have to engage in some mental gymnastics to make this stick. But the world is filled with people and groups making claims about cause and effect, making claims about who and what make things happen. And we're seeing that in some of the primary sources for this webinar series too. So if you're working the Johnstown flood, pay attention to what your primary sources say is responsible for this massive disaster, because there are plenty of sources that place the responsibility for it as, it's an act of nature, right? This is a thing that just happened. And that's a claim about agency. No human person or group made it happen. But there's some other sources that are much more specific and say this is not something that just happened, but it is something that a small group of people engineered or caused or allowed to happen. And that's a claim about agency too, right? Who or what had the power to make the flood occur Well, there's competing ideas out there. And one of the things about agency is it's not necessarily something we can measure with a yardstick or a Geiger counter. It's something that historians identify by looking carefully at primary sources and patterns of power. Agency, in most cases, is an argument about the reasons that things happen. So Matt Gaetz says he caused the speakership to be vacated. The Republican Congressional Committee says it was the Democrats' responsibility. These are arguments about why a particular thing happened. And that's a really nice segue for tonight, which is going to be talking about making arguments in a very nuts and bolts way. And I'll point out that the idea of turning points, a critical part of this year's National History Day theme, is in itself an argument, right? It's a claim about the importance of a particular person or a particular event or a particular development. But it's an argument that historians make. It's not like the turning points are just labeled there and that as people are living through a particular event, they say, oh, we just passed a turning point. Turning points are, in the main, something that historians go back and identify afterwards. And so hopefully some of these things are starting to come into a little bit more focus now. We spent webinar 2 talking about perspective, agency, and hindsight and how they can help us unlock insights. One way to think about turning points is a kind of combination of agency and hindsight. That is, looking back and seeing how things changed over time. We can identify important moments, and then we can start asking some questions about, all right, who or what made that moment happen? These are things that historians read into the past, not just things that sort of naturally occur with a Post-it note or a street sign attached. Just pay attention, we're now getting to a turning point. So we can see the centrality of making arguments for historians. So let's dive a little deeper tonight. I like to start with my students, just getting a quick definition of historical argument. And for the purposes of our work here, I think a good kind of introductory definition is that a historical argument makes a claim about the past and supports it with evidence from primary sources. I think that's a very baseline definition that not too many people would argue with, disagree with. And then we can go a little bit further in talking about the different kinds of arguments, or better and worse arguments. And in my experience, the best historical arguments are the ones that make a claim that is compelling or interesting or controversial in some way. In other words, a claim that a reasonable person could be on the other side of. So we want to have something that is at least open enough to interpretation that someone might take the other side. Let's look at some potential historical arguments that I think aren't particularly compelling. So I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 90s. So I had a good front row seat to the Chicago Bulls. Here's an argument you could make about professional basketball in that decade. You could say, in the 1990s, the Chicago Bulls were a dominant team in the NBA. The problem is it's just not very interesting because, with perhaps the greatest player of all time and 6 NBA championships, that seems pretty obvious to anybody. So there's not a counter position someone would take. To take things further back into the past, the history of the civil rights movement, you could make the argument that the 1963 I Have a Dream speech was an important moment in the civil rights movement. The problem is that neither of those things are compelling enough that somebody might disagree with you, right? The opposing argument that the Chicago Bulls weren't particularly dominant, or that the I Have a Dream speech wasn't a particularly important moment, are not interesting arguments. They are what scholars refer to as straw men, right? They're so weak they can't defend themselves. Nobody would take that side. And so what we want to do is push an observation a little further until we get into something that is more interesting. So here's an argument that's not particularly compelling on the surface, that Martin Luther King Jr. was a key figure in the civil rights movement. Nobody could possibly have a serious objection to that statement. And as a result, it's not a particularly interesting argument to base an essay around. But we could go a little further and say, well, King's intellect and religiosity made him the key figure of the civil rights movement. And that strikes me as interesting in two ways. First, it makes a claim about what made King such a distinctive figure and picks out two character traits that someone might be able to argue against. And then second, it elevates him from a key figure to the key figure. And both of those things are interesting claims because somebody could come and take the opposite side. For example, somebody might acknowledge that King was important, that he was an important organizer in the movement, but that most of the actual work for civil rights was undertaken by scores of local groups rather than a single charismatic leader. So now we've got a disagreement. We've got a point of contention. That means we have something interesting, and it means we have something to build an argument around. Often when my students come to me with a rough draft, they have something that isn't particularly compelling, and I think they set the bar low because they feel like the less controversial a statement they make, the easier it will be for them to support. And the problem for me is it's kind of like, Olympic diving, like a very low degree of difficulty. It's easy to get over that bar, but you're not getting a whole lot of points for showing that Martin Luther King was important in the civil rights movement. These other arguments have a little more compelling thread to them. And that gives us a chance to talk a little bit about how to begin persuading your audience, your reader, of the argument you're trying to make. And here I think both in my students' writing and my own writing about two kinds of broad categories that writing tends to fall into: description and analysis. Very simple, my working definitions, that descriptive writing is, the who, what, when, and where, basic factual material. And that analytical writing is the why and the how. Or, another way to think about it is that descriptive writing is mostly concerned with facts and relaying information, and analytical writing is focused on giving those facts meaning. Facts are statements that we can establish with primary sources. It's information that we can cite to something. Meaning is the way we select these facts and the way that we assemble them into a story to give them bigger significance. So we've got two kinds of writing that work together in a successful historical essay. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of how to do that. And our last two webinars have a lot more practical advice that you can use with your students, and a lot more kind of nuts and bolts of the mechanics of writing and outlining and organizing. When I think of descriptive and analytical writing in my own work, I often think of the original kind of one knob stereo systems that had just one knob that went from bass to treble, so you could adjust the thing back and forth. But the thing with this knob is that if you're turning the bass up, it's coming out of the treble. If you turn the treble up, it's at the expense of the bass. And when we're thinking about writing, I think of the knob as, kind of between description and analysis. But it reminds me that any space I dedicate to one is coming at the expense of the other. I have a 2-page essay, I've got a certain amount of space to fill, and any sentences or paragraphs that are being taken up with description are coming out of the analysis. Anything that I'm dedicating to analysis is coming out of the description. I will say that the overwhelming majority of my students, at least when they start, are much, much, much more comfortable writing description. And so if I had to kind of visualize how their papers look, it would be like this, overwhelmingly facts and information, and then occasionally a lone sentence thrown in with, maybe a cautious argument or a cautious attempt to connect it to some bigger claim. So most of my students, if we had to visualize it, I think their knob is, almost all the way on description. And then I got a few students who have turned it all the way down to description and are unwilling, or I think sometimes maybe afraid, to put analysis in there, because analysis is not something that you can cite to a primary source. It's your contribution to understanding. And I think for my students and for me, often you feel kind of vulnerable when you're doing that. Maybe this isn't right. Maybe someone's going to argue against this. Maybe my side isn't the right side. So this is kind of a standard fear to have. But I think a paper that is, all description is mostly just information dump. It doesn't really help persuade the reader of any larger significance or meaning. So if you've got a 2-page essay and all but one sentence is just facts and details, it's generally not that successful. And while I don't think there's a sort of perfect mix of 42% this and 58% that, I like to think that the sweet spot is somewhere roughly balanced. And I will often whip out the highlighters and actually go back and color code my own work or my students' work to visually look at, what the split looks like and where I've put different kinds of information. So this is the old MS Word print preview, which is a good general way to kind of think about how you've allocated your space. And this to me would be more in line with what I would hope to see as a reader. Am I still good, Lynn?
You're good. I'm just getting excited about polls. That's all.
Oh, great. Okay. This is about how I would, I would aspire to have a kind of even 50-50 blend. So let's walk through a sort of example, and then we'll do some talk alouds or some think alouds with quizzes. So I'm going to give you some paragraphs here that revolve around the 1863 Battle of Gettysburg. Why? Because I'm teaching the Civil War next semester and I've been getting ahead on my class prep. So it's front of mind. If you teach American history, you probably know at least, a sentence or two about this battle. Let's kind of imagine how someone could write it up. So you might start by saying, Confederate army was much smaller than the Union army. Lee's Confederate army marched on short rations. Many of them lacked shoes. Nevertheless, the troops marched towards Gettysburg confident of victory. They arrived on July 1st. Now, everything I'm going to show you tonight is, any historical fact is accurate. So there's nothing to critique here on the basis of the information, but let's kind of go through and evaluate each of these sentences. The army was much smaller than the Union army. That's true. The men had short rations and some of them were without shoes. Also true. The troops marched to Gettysburg confident of victory. We could actually establish that from primary sources because we have soldiers who wrote letters or diary entries saying that they knew they were going to win whatever battle they would fight next. And the Confederate army arrived on July 1st. All those things are true. All the factual information is accurate, but it's also all just description. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be convinced of as a reader. So let's lay that paragraph aside and look at a slightly revised version. While Lee's Confederate army was smaller than the opposing Union force, numbers alone would not decide the outcome of the battle. Because they had already prevailed 5 times over their larger, better equipped foe, Lee's men marched towards Gettysburg confident of victory. Leadership would be more important than numbers in the battle. Let's do the same sentence by sentence thing and kind of figure out where the description and where the analysis is. Okay, so the first half of the sentence is description because we've got an established fact, but then we've got some analysis. We've got a claim that numbers alone are not going to dictate the outcome. That's not something we can determine from primary sources. So the writer is now kind of staking out some territory. Here we've got another mix, except the analysis is first and the detail is second. Because of these things, that therefore they believed this. And again, the first part in gold is kind of analysis. It's coming up with an explanation for a phenomenon. And then that last sentence is just pure analysis. It's making a claim about what was going to be the critical thing. And so here we've got a kind of nice blend of analysis, making a historical argument about what is going to be important in this historical battle, backed up with the evidence that helps support those claims. And you'll notice that there are certain kinds of words that cue the reader to know when the analysis is coming. Words like while and because are making implicit claims about cause and effect, right? Because of this thing, therefore this thing. And those are ways that good writers leave signposts for their readers to let them know, this is the connection that I see here. This is what I'm trying to convince you of. All right. That's historical interpretation. It's assembling primary source evidence and analysis into a coherent argument. Effective historical interpretation has got to do more than just present a lot of facts. So we can't have all read in the page preview. We have to have a mix of description and analysis, because it's the analysis that tells your reader how the facts fit together and what they tell us. All right, let's play along with our home game. I've got 3 think alouds for you tonight. And what I'm going to do is just put up a paragraph. And as you listen to me read it aloud, be thinking through each sentence or each clause, whether what you hear sounds more like description or more like analysis. And then on balance, do you think the paragraph you heard is mostly description, mostly analytical, or a mix of both? Lynn, are we ready?
We're good to go.
Fantastic. Let's go with the very first paragraph. Oh, hang on one second. The election of 1876 was the most important and consequential election of the 19th century. The Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes only prevailed because self-interested politicians in his own party struck a corrupt bargain to deliver the victory. That bargain was the reason that Reconstruction failed to deliver racial justice to Southern Blacks. Okay, so we've got 3 sentences. What does it sound like to you? More description, more analysis, or a good mix?
And again, what does your gut say? Don't agonize over it. We're going to end it in about 3 seconds, so put your answer in. All right, the results are 14% descriptive, 61% analytical, 25% both.
I think when I drew that up, most of the sentences are primarily analytical. So that if you go back and look at it on the web broadcast, you'll see that there's a lot of claims, interpretation, and less factual information. Let's do a second one. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. It would go on to sell 300,000 copies in the United States. The evil slave owner Simon Legree became one of the most infamous villains of 19th century fiction. So again, mostly description, mostly analysis, or a mix of both. I'll say when I was practicing this as a graduate student, I would bring out the colored pens and I would force myself to go through my own writing and then my students' writing, kind of getting myself comfortable making these diagnoses about where the knob was adjusted.
Okay. Well, our audience tonight says 83% descriptive. Nobody went for analytical, and 17% a mix of both. Interesting result.
Yeah, great. And I think, in this case, it's pretty clear. Most of these statements are just kind of flat statements of fact. We can establish the book sales. We can establish the year of publication. But book sales and publication info is not that important for a reader. It doesn't really deliver much beyond that. Let's do one more, and then I'm going to turn things over to Lynn for talk about a triangular approach to structuring your thinking. The Equal Rights Amendment, first approved by the House in 1971, remains one of the great missed opportunities in American politics. The amendment enjoyed bipartisan support in Congress. It eventually received 35 of the required 38 state ratifications. Ultimately, it was doomed by the work of Phyllis Schlafly, who argued that the amendment would actually leave women with fewer rights by removing legal protections and exposing them to the draft. All right, same exercise. More factual information, more interpretation, or a mix of both?
Oh, we're responding faster. We're getting more excited.
Great. Oh.
Go ahead. Last answers. Let's put them in. All right. Looks like our responses: 11% descriptive, 1% analytical, and 88% went for a mix.
And I think this one is a good mix of, it's almost half and half. And I think one other thing about that paragraph is that's the most satisfying paragraph to read. It's the one that looks the most like, really good historical writing that you might see in a textbook or a journal article. And so that seems to me to be in the sweet spot. And this kind of visual diagnosis can be really helpful. It's not rocket science. You can do it, and you can have your students do it. And now I'm going to hand things over to Lynn. I'm going to take notes because this is such a helpful approach. And she's going to talk a little bit more about taking these ideas and kind of thinking about them graphically too. So you're up, Lynn.
All right. Well, thanks, Christopher. All right. Well, for those of you in the audience, I think I've mentioned this to a lot of you. I started off as a classroom teacher. I spent 5 years teaching middle school, and I spent 7 years at the high school level. And I started off with 7th graders. And for those of you who are middle school teachers, especially who work with 7th graders, you know that they're an interesting and challenging bunch, right? What they need to be able to do is you're working with students mostly around the age of 12. And honestly, they're very different in where their intellectual development is. Some days they are really sophisticated and will connect to events in history, and you watch the light bulb. And I love 7th graders because you can see it in their face when they get excited. That same student 5 minutes later can fall off their chair. So the first time, and I'm not saying push, I say fall because it happens and you've seen it. The first time I was going to go teach these students historical argumentation, I was driving to work in my little Saturn Ion, and I had one of these light bulb lesson plan moments. And I know you had these. It's actually a whole lot of fun. And I was thinking like, okay, how in the world am I going to help my students understand how to create a historical argument when they think that this is what an argument looks like, right? It's people arguing against each other. So like Christopher said, setting up a clear definition of what we're trying to do is helpful. And I was also thinking like, okay, if I'm going to make this relevant, I need my students to understand how this works in real life so they can understand how it works in history. And the aha moment that I had was to set up what I used to call ARE triangles. And it's a triangle on purpose. So A is the argument, R is the reasoning, and E is the evidence to support. Now, it's a triangle on purpose. It's not a rectangle. And the reason is the evidence has to be the biggest part, right? Because if you have all your weight on the top of the triangle and not much in the bottom, it's going to tip over. And that gave me a visual to help work with my students. If you work with middle schoolers too, you know that they are very much about establishing independence and wanting things, wanting to do, wanting to try, wanting to get, wanting to buy. So I said, okay, let's use that to our advantage. And I would start with each class and, who's got your brain? What is it that you really want? And I'd work with the students on the board, and we'd develop it. There was variations on this, but we'd say, okay, what do you really want? I want a new bike. Okay, well, why do you want the bike? And why is it that I should buy you that new bike? And what we would do is distinguish between the reasoning, the why, or I would say what's the because, and the evidence to back it up. So if your argument is that you want a bike and your reasoning is that you're responsible, these are things, an argument is something that I can, a reasonable person can debate against, and reasoning can be argued. You could say you're very responsible. I might challenge it and say, I don't know, prove it to me. And I would say to my students, give me the primary evidence. How could I know, or how could you convince me that you're very responsible? And they would start to brainstorm lists of things that you could see, right? You can see if a room is clean or not. You can check with a parent to see if a student's getting up to get to school on time by themselves. You can check grades to see if they're being responsible. You could talk to other teachers to see if they're being a good citizen. You can measure the student to see if they're too tall. And I would say, okay, that's your evidence. That's the evidence you're going to use to make your case, to set up your argument that's supported by your reasoning. And if we look at the ARE triangle, I would literally make one of these and we would leave it up in the room. Because when students would start to struggle with history, we'd point back to the triangle and talk about where they were, and that would help them. So you're working with Samba, and again, sorry, real quick. It's the what I want to argue, the why I want to argue it, and the primary source to support it. All right, you're working in your sandboxes, right? You got Kansas, Nebraska, or Johnstown flood. I created a sample, but I'm going to work in a different sandbox, right? Because I'm not going to give you my Johnstown flood argument or my Kansas, Nebraska Act argument. I'm going to give you my argument using the topic of women's suffrage. So what we did was I worked with another colleague. We gave ourselves 1 hour, 5 keywords, and we had to pull some sources from the Library of Congress. So just a real quick look of some of the stuff you can find in an hour. There's lots of photographs of women protesting publicly in Washington, D.C., probably the famous ones outside of the White House, but lots of other locations too. Found this great article. I love the title, Women's Suffrage Ably Discussed by Mrs. Elizabeth Smith Miller. There's some interesting language in this one, but it's talking about, how this is a reasonable argument. Here's a flyer, something that women were passing out on the streets in New York City. So giving information to other people. So that's an interesting primary source. Also found photographs of the parade that accompanied the presidential inauguration, protesting for suffrage. And I know from my secondary sources, there were issues about African-American women being allowed or not allowed to march in the parade and what those, especially Ida B. Wells, did. But I also found some things that I wasn't really expecting to find. I found sheet music where there were songs written about, why you should have votes for women that were being published and sold to a mass media market. Found this postcard with one little girl telling the little boy why they should have votes for women. I also found a really interesting article about Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee, a young Chinese woman who is arguing for the right to vote. That was in Chronicling America. Also found some correspondence from Mary Church Terrell to her husband, talking about going to Europe with Jane Addams and making speeches in favor of women's suffrage. Finally, a photograph of a group of African-American women at a Baptist convention, so at a religious convention, and they're talking about and protesting for suffrage. So there's a lot of different really interesting sources. Also, I like this article. It was in a newspaper from Washington, D.C. called The Colored American, and it was a women's case in equity. So there's a lot of really interesting pieces to this article as well. And then I started finding things to say, okay, well, maybe we need to look outside of the mainland or the 50 states. And I found the photograph on the left was Mrs. Harding speaking with a group of Filipino women, because when the 19th Amendment passes, it doesn't include women in the territories. In addition, found a letter from Milagros Bennett de Newton to Carrie Chapman Catt, and talking about the rights of women in Puerto Rico to be able to vote. Now, it's really important, we've talked about this before, that you have to make sure that your evidence drives your thesis and not the other way around. So, as I start to assemble this evidence, I start to revise the thesis statement. And we've had lots of conversations with people where we've been asked, like, is it okay to change my thesis? Is it okay to go in a different direction? 100% yes. Not only are we encouraging you, please encourage your students to tweak and develop as they go. All right, so I've got to take this evidence and I've got to organize it. And what I do is I use the bucket method, literally. Do it physically, do it on a chalkboard, do it on a smart board, do it on a Jamboard, doesn't really matter. I've got to organize this. And what I found was that I found a lot about public forums, things like parades and protests and being active agents in the political process. So that was my first bucket. And my second bucket was really all about media. I've got lots of newspaper articles. I've got lots of messages targeted to certain subgroups of women. And I've got the sheet music and these postcards. This is about using different forms of media. But I also noticed with my research that there's something about the 19th Amendment really didn't go far enough, right? It didn't extend to the women in the Philippines or Puerto Rico. It didn't extend to many African-American women. It didn't extend to many immigrant women. So this is kind of how I'm going to bucket. So then what I did was I took my buckets and I wrote my thesis. All right, so I'm going to take my risk. I'm going to workshop my thesis now. So I wrote, from 1900 to 1920, national leaders of the women's suffrage movement used public forums, including parades, protests, and newspapers, to create a turning point and pass the 19th Amendment. However, leaders ignored the needs of women of color, resulting in limited enfranchisement for many women. Okay, Time to test it. We're going to test on the same 4 parameters that we ask you to test it. And honestly, do the color coding thing with your students. It helps. When I think I've got a thesis, I do this, and sometimes I find out I've got to fix part of mine too. All right, what's my topic? That's pretty clear. I'm focusing on the leadership of the suffrage movement, not the entire movement, but the leaders who were in charge. And I'm going to focus on the way they use these public forums to create a turning point. What are my parameters? 1900 to 1920. I'm not going back into the 1840s. I'm not talking about the 1960s. Do I have a connection to the theme? Yep. We've got to have a turning point. Don't make it hard for yourselves. Call it a turning point. Were there one? Was there two? Did one reverse the other? But make sure something's a turning in these thesis statements. And finally, is it an argument or a statement of fact? I'm going to make the case that it's the public forums that made the difference. Now, Christopher could look at this and be like, wait, Lynn, you're not thinking about women in World War I. You're not talking about what's going on in the Wilson administration. You're not talking about what was happening before that set this up. We can have those arguments all day long, but this is my argument that I want to take. And I'm making a pretty bold statement that these leaders outright ignored the needs of other women. Now, some people could argue that they didn't know, they didn't understand, but again, this is my argument. I'm going to be a little provocative. I'm going to be really clear about that statement, but I've got to be able to prove it. So then I'm going to take my buckets and turn them into triangles. My argument is that the leaders use public forums. Why? Because they wanted to put the debate in the public eye and turn public opinion. And then what kind of evidence do I have? And here's the key. This is where those analysis skills from the first 2 modules come out. I might show these inaugural parade photographs, but I'm going to make notes about them. I'm going to talk about how these are public. I'm going to talk about how the women are dressed, how they show up with signs that show that they're professionals, that they have PhDs, or that they have doctorates, or that they're factory workers. I'm going to talk about the protests in DC or outside the White House. And I'm going to say, not only were they weren't asking, they were demanding change. They were also embarrassing the president, especially calling him Kaiser Wilson. This is where I can bring in some of that World War I and suffrage piece. And I can also use the photograph of the women at the Baptist Convention to say, hey, this is being discussed inside religious circles. That's a different way to turn public opinion. Let's take a look at my second bucket. My argument is that the leaders use new forms of media. Well, why? Because they wanted to challenge opposition. They wanted to challenge it outright. So this is where I'm going to say, hey, look at where they're writing. They're women who are speaking and writing in widely read publications that either had national or local audiences. I can talk about how some publications were used to target the specific needs and issues to one subgroup of women, such as the article in The Colored American. Or I can look at things like postcards and sheet music by talking about how it's integrating arguments into popular culture, but also into children's culture now, right? If kids are going to sing the song, that's going to start putting the message into other adult heads. And finally, the action of not only just having this flyer, but handing it out. That's a form of public citizenship, and that's engaging in the public sphere. So note, I've got my evidence, but I'm using my interpretation to point and say, hey, this is what's really important about this evidence. All right, final triangle, the last piece of my argument, is that in order to pass the amendment, they ignored the needs of women of color. And I'm going to make the case, they gave that up to get the amendment passed. They were willing to let some things go. And that's where I can talk about Florence Harding with the Filipina delegation. I can talk about Mary Terrell giving a speech in German. How fun is that? At a world convention, and talking about this idea of not all women are enfranchised. I can look at the issue of what's going on in Puerto Rico. I can also bring in the idea of Jim Crow laws and restrictions on voting that were placed on new citizens. And that's going to help me say, like, hey, the 19th Amendment didn't go far enough. It took till the Voting Rights Act in order to make sure that everybody who was supposed to be allowed to vote in the Constitution was actually allowed to vote. Okay, so what's our plan here? like I said, I've dropped a sample argumentation plan where I've kind of fleshed this out into Google Classroom to give you a working exemplar model. You're going to turn in your argumentation plan by noon on Monday, the 27th. From there, what Krista and I are going to do is download all of them and set up your peer edit circles. In Module 4, there's no discussion, but instead we're going to do a peer editing activity where you're going to give feedback to 2 other argumentation plans and get feedback on yours from at least 2 people. So we will have that set up by Wednesday, the 29th. Honestly, our goal is to have it set up by Tuesday and launched. You'll have a week to tackle and put in your peer edits. We'll meet on December 6th for our 4th webinar. And then you have a week to turn in your final plans. So we'll accept them anytime between the 7th and the 15th of December. And then the last piece is the final course survey. That'll be due by the 20th. And again, we'll send reminders and links on all this. And we will ask, we've been so grateful for all the sponsors who've made this course possible. We are going to reach out and ask you to send us electronic thank you notes for the sponsors. So just have that kind of in the back of your head. All right. We did an awful lot here, but we'd love to open it up for questions. We're actually a little under time, which is kind of exciting for us because Christopher and I are never under time. But that means it's more time for question and discussion. So if you have to go, we understand, but take a minute, write it down, tinyurl.com/NHD-HAWS Historical Argumentation Webinar Series. I'm not that creative. 24. It's the same link as we use for all the webinars. Pop it in, give us your feedback. As Krista and Christopher will tell you, I'll do a pull tomorrow and share out the early feedback. And then we do a full report once everybody's had the makeup week, where we sit down every month and say, hey, what worked, what didn't, what do we want to tweak? Where do we need more time? Where do we need less time? So keep the feedback coming. All right. At this point, please go ahead into the Q&A box. If you've got questions about any of this, right? Argumentation, teaching analytical writing, helping to balance it out. If you've got questions about how to teach it to students, or heck, if you just got a generic History Day question, we're here and we would love to answer it. All right, Krista, do we have anybody in the queue?
We do have a request.
All right.
The first request is, can we go back a slide and have you talk us through a bit more on the worksheet model?
Yes. Actually, give me just a sec. Let me pull up a blank copy of it because it's going to be much easier for me to talk through it that way. So take a second. Everybody jot it down your URL. All right. Is there another question? Let me pull that up and then we'll take the other question and then I'll jump through that.
Yep, we have another question. Do we have to have 3 pyramids or buckets?
Ah, good question. Christopher, what's the best way if you're trying to structure something that's going to fit into like that 10-minute doc or the 15 to 2,500 words? How would you do that?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's a hard and fast answer, but I think 3 is a good starting point. And then sometimes I will go to 2 or sometimes I will go to 4. But in this case, I'm kind of guided by what I'm finding in the primary sources themselves. And so that's the interpretation that you're performing as a historian, is how can I group the things that I've noticed about primary sources through historical thinking skills? Do they naturally cohere into 2 groups, into 3 groups, into 4 groups? If I've only got one thing to say, then I sometimes think I need to either spend more time with these sources or I need to look for some new sources. And if I've got, 18 buckets, I think maybe this is a little too ambitious for a 750 word essay or a 500 word essay. So those are kind of 2 warning signs I get that I need to get more stuff, or I've already got too much and I need to start the process of paring down.
And I think, we joke about the fairy tale rule, like there's 3 little bears and, and all that. But I think it really does help students to have some structure, right? Because if you think about it in this way, if they can group it into 3 big categories, that can be 3 sides of an exhibit board or about 2 to 3 minutes in a documentary. Now, not everything absolutely structures that way, but it's a good rule of thumb, because if you really only have one argument, there's probably something we can expand to or stretch to. Or what you might find sometimes, I find sometimes I start writing one up and then I'm like, oh, wait a second, that's really its own argument. Maybe that needs to go off into another column and I need to tweak my headers. And as you write evidence, you should be tweaking the top part. And that's part of the structure, part of the idea.
Those were excellent responses in a larger sense of what it's like to conduct historical research and get yourself set up. For this specific assignment, are we asking our participants to have 2 buckets, 3 buckets, 17 buckets?
Yes, we're saying we really want you to have 3 buckets, right? Sometimes it's not exactly that. If anything, buckets tend to be more, but for this, we want to keep it manageable. So let's shoot for 3 buckets.
Okay. And if someone has, say, 2 buckets, might they get marked down for that? Are we really holding fast to the idea of 3 buckets?
I think for this, it's good because we want you to really kind of push your thinking a little. And hey, if you're like, hey, I've got 2 solid ones and I don't know where the 3rd one is, that's a great thing. Pop by office hours, shoot us a note. Chances are it's already in there. Because a lot of times what we find when people have 2 is that they've kind of shoved 2 into 1 and we can be like, wait a second, that's really something different. Let's move that over.
Okay, great.
All right. I pulled up the argumentation plan.
Oh, great.
If it's okay, let's do a quick little run through of this. And I'm going to go ahead and make it just a little bigger for those of you who might be a little more blind like me. All right. In the argumentation plan, first part, revise thesis. Just like before, you've got the same reminders, drop it in here. Now, every project needs a little bit of historical context. What's going on around here? Don't overthink this. A couple quick bullets is fine. You've worked your way up to this. So we talk about big C context. What's happening in the nation at this time? What's happening in the world? Why is this significant to your topic? Little C context. Who are the key players? Who are we talking about? And what's going on right around where this occurred? So that's just like our setup. And I think sometimes a lot of we were in the early phases of thesis writing. A lot of people were trying to put context into their thesis. This is where this goes. This is going to help set up your argument. All right, so the sub-arguments are the tops of your triangles, right? What's the sub-argument you're going to make? Remember, this has to be arguable. A reasonable person can disagree. And then, what's the evidence and the reasoning that you're using to support that? Finally, the analysis. This is your conclusion. So what? Because of this, why does it matter? And again, we're looking for 1 to 2 sentences here. Now, one of the things you can do, take a look at the sample that I posted on women's suffrage. This will give you an idea. We're not necessarily writing paragraphs in any of these boxes. We're putting a sentence or 2, maybe a couple bullet points. The key is you've got to make your thinking visible, not just to your facilitator, but also the peers who are going to take a look at it. And essentially what we're doing here in about 2, maybe 3 pages is we're mapping out the guts of what would become your History Day exhibit board or your documentary or your paper. It's not every detail you could possibly have. And again, the goal is not necessarily to have a perfect draft. The goal is to have a complete, well thought out draft that you can then focus your time in module 4 to tweak and edit and shift. And again, you're showing your students, look how my thinking has evolved. Look how my evidence helps to support my thesis. And in the end, so what? Why does this matter? Let me know if that helps. And again, if you have more specific questions or questions more specific to you, we're more than happy to talk to you and help you.
Okay, I am bucketing some questions.
All right.
And we have a couple of questions about accessing resources and resources from webinars. So can you remind folks where they can find the slides from webinars? We have 2 questions about that. And will there be a picture of the bucket? Oh, yes, there will be because the slides are available.
Exactly. So every time we do a live webinar, the next morning, we post a tag in Google Classroom. Tomorrow it'll be called Webinar 3 Materials in the middle of Module 3. And it'll have all the materials there. So you'll have a copy of the slides. You'll have any of the visuals that you want. You'll also have the link to the recording. So if it's like, hey, I missed this part or I want to rewatch this part, everything will get posted there in the morning. Honestly, it's just a matter of waiting for it to upload to YouTube and render so that you can see it. But by mid-morning, it'll be posted.
Okay, just reviewing again here. Okay, so this is a question about the choosing different kinds of context when making those sub-arguments. So someone asked, should we stick to 4 contexts? So for example, what's going on in society, economy, culture, and politics? Or is that too many?
I'm not sure what you mean by sticking to context.
Christopher, is this maybe getting back to what the examples that you were providing?
So this is not an exercise for me, and my students are not doing National History Day, but not a sort of checklist of you must have 4 of this, 2 of this, 3 of this. I think that kind of structure is really useful for students who are still getting used to them. But for me and my thinking about history, it's not 4 contexts, this, and this. It's something that I consider when I think about this particular phenomenon that I'm trying to explain. So what are the most relevant things that bear on the the episode or the turning point that we're looking at? In the case of women's suffrage, those seem to be pretty spot on, right? You do want to think about what's happening in politics. You do want to think about what's happening in the economy and what's happening in the broader culture. But I can think of other examples where 4 might be a little bit of overkill, and I can think of some examples where 4 would maybe not be sufficient to explain what's going on.
Okay, someone's looking for a bit more guidance about how many primary sources they should be targeting to find in order to support their arguments. They want to know what's a good number of sources that will help support their claims. And they noticed that the sample had about 4. Does that seem good? Is that what folks should be aiming for?
I think for this exercise, having about 3 to 4 pieces of evidence to support each sub-argument is a good logical way. Now, a couple things to keep in mind if that sounds overwhelming. Don't let it be. You've got the whole primary source packet to work with. You've got all of the sources that you've gone and dug out of the library. In addition, in the Module 3 discussion board, you saw other resources that other people pulled to help support their arguments. There's nothing wrong with doing it. Essentially, this is an exercise in assembling what's the best information. Now, remember, just like in the sample, please link to your source. It's really important that especially your facilitator can actually see it, right? So they've got to be able to verify that. And all right, I'll answer this question because I know we're going to get it. Do they all have to be from the Library of Congress? All right, I'll be clear here. Majority do. So 60 to 75% need to be from the Library of Congress. Because remember, that's a big goal here, right? It's part of us, what we're doing is helping you search and helping you find. If we just say, no, go find them anywhere, that kind of defeats that point. But if you've got 1 or 2 that you're like, wow, this is a great source and I want to put it in there, that's fine. But double check, and this is something we got to be real clear with. The evidence is going to be pulled from those primary sources, not secondary sources. There's great books on these topics. There's great blog posts and podcasts, and they might have influenced your thinking, and that's okay, right? That's what secondary sources do. But in the end, the evidence has to be primary. We don't want to echo somebody else's interpretation because I like their article or I like their book.
Okay, we have a really wonderful question that gets to the full heart of the matter.
Excellent.
And the question reads, so my turning point can be whatever I want, as long as I find sources to support me and I can argue it, right?
Ding, 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 ding. You got it. Really. It's not about, and it's not necessarily what I would argue. Like we talk about a lot of times when Chris are going through this, like that might be my argument. He's going to give a different argument. That doesn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. If the evidence is there, you can make the case. And you're right, there's going to be stronger arguments and weaker arguments. But part of history is saying, well, I see that you did this, but did you consider that? Have you read about this person? Why do you think that person opposed it? What is it about 1932 that would have made that person oppose this law? And that's where the discussion and the argumentation makes history interesting, because you're right, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. That's the coolest part about what we get to do.
Okay, we have some question about classroom application. So Lynn, you talked about spending an hour with a colleague trying to find sources. Someone wants to know if you think that this might be a good exercise to bring to a classroom. And maybe it could be iterative, that an instructor could bring it to a classroom a couple of times to try and help teach students how to find sources.
I would say yes, if. So here's the key. The Library of Congress, like any repository, is going to have the areas it's really good at sources and areas that it's not so great. So, for example, we talked a little bit earlier about how like 1880 to 1920 is a sweet spot. So if you're teaching the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era, giving students different topics and then teaching them how to search, the general search box, teaching them to search chronicling America, teaching them how to filter and do their searches, yes, they're going to find lots of good things. I think that would make sense. However, if your students are researching like the oil embargo in the 70s, that's not the library sweet spot. They're going to spend a lot of time searching and not finding a lot of content. So I would say yes, if you can set them up with topics in which they can succeed. And depending on what your students are doing, the library can be like the greatest source, or you might get 1 or 2 things, but it's probably not going to be your most helpful, because you should be researching at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, or you should be researching at the State Historical Society, just based on whatever it is you're looking for.
Okay, speaking of searching for different sources, we have folks who are still struggling to find sources on the Library of Congress. I'll say, drop in my office hours, send me an email. I'm happy to walk you through. I'm happy to talk about some strategies. Are there any specific strategies that are available on the Google Classroom site that folks have access to?
So we've got some videos posted from earlier modules. We also have the search strategies in the teacher guide. So again, it's hard for us to say, well, here's the strategy that's going to work for you. But if you set up a time and talk to us, one of the things that Chris and I always do is we always start with, okay, tell us what you've been doing. What are your keywords? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And then from there, we can give you some specific tips, or have you tried this keyword? Let's try to find one source and then click on those more sources like this, or you might also like, because you're right, the library is a bit of a rabbit hole, and we have all been Alice going down that rabbit hole. But I think it's important to say it's more about an individualized plan than a one-size-fits-all. We've got some of that out there, but again, we're more than happy to help you. But don't overlook the work you've already done, and don't overlook the work that your peers have done, right? That's intentional. We could have had you submit, rather than doing a discussion, just submit the assignment to your facilitator. But we said, hey, we want to share and expand people's ideas of what's out there.
Okay, we have a question that zooms out a little bit. They're curious if we could share some of the educational resource behind the course, and if there have been any kinds of studies, reports that discuss or give best practices for the best ways to teach historical argumentation.
Absolutely. And Christopher, I have your email. I'm actually working on a response. I pulled a couple, but I wanted to pull something from my home office. So I will be getting back to you. I promise I'm not ignoring the email. I'll just say some of my go-to people, I think, looking at Sam Weinberg's work is really important. Another person who's a big go-to for me is Chauncey Montesanto at, I believe, University of Michigan, in terms of looking at the educational theory behind behind kind of social studies instruction and teaching historical thinking skills in explicit ways. I think, though, a lot of kind of what we do in History Day is kind of bridge the gap in that we're looking at the best practices of what goes on in the with historians and in their field, but then talking about how to apply that. So those are kind of my top two go-tos. But I'm assuming you probably know this from your research, but eric.ed.gov is a great source for searching for up-to-date journal articles. Some are downloadable for free, some aren't. But chances are, if you're doing a degree, you probably have access to a university library that if you find a good citation, you should be able to pull it. So whenever I'm stuck or need a research citation, eric.ed.gov it's obviously the US Department of Education's search engine, I find is very helpful for me. So Christopher or Krista, anything else that you find helpful?
I just want to double and triple underline Sam Weinberg's books, Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, which was kind of the thing that got me started down this path. And more recently, his Why Study History When It's All in Your Phone. Those are not necessarily, as Lynn said, things that you're going to kind of read and then that afternoon take into your classroom, but they're great in kind of talking about the theory and kind of the empirical basis for how we think about the past, and particularly how we teach people to think about the past. So that's where I start.
That was also my gateway drug for getting into thinking about why and how to teach history. I'm involved in a group of people called the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in History. So thinking about allowing the way that we teach history to be a legitimate object of study. And this is a group of people and a way of thinking that has certainly expanded over the last 30 years. It's sort of relatively new-ish. But if you look up SOTL in history, and I'll share some resources about that on everyone's Google Classroom page, but I found that to be incredibly helpful. Okay, I'm just reviewing some of the questions. Some of them here I will respond to people one-on-one in a follow-up email, but I'm just seeing if there's anything here that's good for the general group. Here's a general NHT question. I was wondering if you can recommend a way to involve the particular state that we live in the topic selection, especially if we live in a small state.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that we like to forget is that history happens everywhere. So I like to tell students, first off, figure out what time you're interested. Are you interested in a particular time or a topic? And then look at the resources. Every state has either a state historical society or a state library or a humanities council. And if you're like, hey, I'm really interested in the Industrial Revolution, then start to ask questions like, hey, during that time period, what was going on in my state or my city or my community? And sometimes it's a matter of simply walking through a town or a community and saying like, oh, wait, what was this building? What was this big factory? What did they make here? And oftentimes that's going to start because no matter what topic you want to research, there are local versions and connections in every place in America. Because remember, national movements are simply amalgamations of all the things happening in all the different places.
Okay, we have a really interesting question here about, I think, scale or considering scale when we're searching the LOC or other repositories for things. And this person says that their problem in searching for sources has been that I think I need sources from a date farther away from the actual flood date. So they need some time and perspective. I'm not sure when people started speculating or blaming who caused the flood. And that so many of the sources that they're finding are about what happened during and immediately after the flood. So what are some strategies that people might have in order to allow historical time to pass? How can you try to find how people's thoughts are developing over the longer time scale?
Christopher, do you want to give an answer? And I've got a fun strategy that I found when I get stuck on a similar question.
Especially with the Johnstown flood, because this is, your backyard almost literally. But I think that's a great question. And I'll tell you one strategy that I've used with a lot of success with my students is anniversaries. It's not uncommon that, a newspaper will go back on the 1 year, the 5 year, the 10-year anniversary of, hey, do you remember that thing that happened? And often just putting the stories that come out right after the event and the 10-year, revisitation will give you some starting point, because you say, what's different about this and what's different about this? Like, to what extent are they simply repeating what they said earlier, and to what extent are they introducing new ideas? And you could do that with, September 11th, like the things that came out September 12th, 2001, the things that come out on the 10th anniversary. Like, there's a lot of change over time there. So anniversaries and nice round numbers are one of the first places I start.
Yeah, you took my idea, which is so not cool, but we'll discuss that. The other piece too is, just like all good research, what are the secondary sources saying? Who are they citing? Where are their stories coming? Because the secondary sources that are written have time. Now, we didn't have time to do a full-blown research project here, right? Because we didn't have you read a secondary book about your topic and dive in and read 5 different articles and 2 encyclopedias and watch a documentary. But as they're going, what are they talking about? Where are their sources coming from? And try to do a little digging to find the when. All right, anything else? I know we've got a couple individual questions, which we'll definitely respond to people tomorrow on there.
So this final question, unless anyone else adds another question, is thinking about ways or different kinds of classroom strategies, like your triangle method, Lynn. And they're asking, are you familiar with thinking maps? They have students complete an impact thinking map before starting their NHD project. It includes context, reporter questions, impact, and legacy. And they're trying to think about how they can mesh that, which has been really effective for them, with the idea of buckets. Does anything strike you about being able to manage some overlap with those strategies?
I think there's a lot of different strategies that get at similar things and might work differently for certain kids. I'm an organizer person. I need things in, that's why buckets for me make perfect sense. But I know from working with a lot of students that concept mapping or thinking mapping, where you have a couple little prompts or subsections, can help, especially if they can visually, literally connect how this leads to that, leads to that. I think the key would be to give some options. Maybe tell students you have to complete one of these 3 different graphic organizers. One might work better for more logical sequential thinkers, and one might work better for more of your kind of free thinking, associative kind of students. I think giving different options is always a good thing when you're working with students. And I don't think they're necessarily exclusive. But what I think you might find is if you try to do too many of them, they're going to get repetitive. And sometimes you have to talk about the Nike rule of writing. As my favorite professor used to say, sometimes we can talk about it all we want. Sometimes you just have to be Nike and just do it. And you just got to write it and get something. Because I think too, that's the step that a lot of our students struggle with, because they don't want to get it wrong, right? And I know a lot of you are at that time of year where you're starting to transition kind of out of research and into project creation. And so giving 1 or 2 of these scaffolding steps helps. Because remember, our goal is not to get the project that goes, the Johnstown flood hit, it was bad, look at the destruction, it was over. Again, all that descriptive, it can be factually accurate and beautifully researched, but we want them to make an argument about what was a turning point and why it mattered and what the big deal is. So a couple little organizers can help students structure that and give it a little bit of some parameters and some frames, so that when they go to write their documentary script, you can say, okay, as you write your script, check off these things as you hit them. And then they'll be like, oh, wait, we forgot to add this part. Let's go and add that back in.
Lynn, I'm just chuckling at your description of yourself as something of an organizer, which strikes me as like LeBron James saying he plays a little basketball, like it's an understatement, to say the least.
Some days it goes better than others. You should see the mess I left on my desk at my office today. But that's part of the fun here. All right.
Okay, no more questions, but just a general comment that this is hard. It's useful and it's hard.
It's super hard. And I really I think we should all acknowledge that and embrace it. And it does get easier, but I I do this, I've done this and nothing but this my entire adult life. And it's hard. Like it's doing worthwhile things often is. And I'm trying to have a lot more empathy with like my students about how hard it is. But yeah, there's no way around it.
Well, and I think we have to be okay with, and I use this phrase in the gym a lot, like you got to embrace the suck. You got to embrace the fact that you don't want to do 10 more, but you've got to do it, right? Because it's that extra bit is going to get you just a little bit stronger and a little bit better. And I think sometimes as teachers, because we're used to being the people with the answers, we get scared to go to
Yeah.
somebody and say like, hey, I don't know how to do this, or I'm got this part and I'm stuck on that part. And I think as teachers, we've got to be a little kinder to ourselves and, not look at popping it on office hours or shooting an email for help as a negative on us or a reflection that we don't know what we're doing or we're not a good teacher. But actually, it's the exact opposite. It's saying, hey, this is what I know. This is what I don't know. And hey, can you help me get stronger here? Can you help me build? I've got a draft. Will you look through it and give me some suggestions? What can I do to help make this better? Because in the end, anything that helps you is going to help your students.
I also want to say like, it not only is this hard, it's like really humbling. It's tough, especially if you're the person at the front of the classroom and you're used to having the answers to be in a radically different position. And I have kind of come to the point in the middle of my career that I need to like embrace that for the importance of empathy, right? So I've tried to get in the habit of like taking classes deliberately in things I'm bad at. Like I'm looking at you, ballroom dance, that I'm terrible at, because it helps remind me how my students feel. Like I'm, decent in front of a classroom now. And when I put a slide up and say, what do you see here? A lot of my students struggle and I'm thinking, come on, it's not that hard. Like, let's see what's up there. And I have to remember that it's easy for me because I've been doing it forever. But my students, when they're trying to do, a new interpretation of a source they've just seen, they're me in that ballroom dance class. Like, why is it left then right? Why is this so hard? Why are they speeding up the tempo? This is all confusing. I'm afraid I look stupid. And I think that kind of humility can actually be really a great asset. It doesn't have to be an uncomfortable feeling. Just like, I'm not good at this yet, or I'm not good at this now.
We talk a lot in classrooms about the power of yet. And I think the more we think about this, the better we get at it.
Okay, one more question did pop up.
All right.
Someone wants to know of a place to get a variety of graphic organizers to help their students.
Ooh, I know of a couple good state affiliates who have that, but I don't have the links off the top of my head. So we'll put that on our list and we'll throw links to a couple good spots into the webinar 3 materials. I've got at least one idea in my head, and I've got one or two more. I just have to look up to see if honestly, where I go when I'm looking for stuff, I go to look at our state programs because they've got some really good stuff out there. So let me pull up a couple, 2 or 3 good options, and we'll drop them into the materials that'll be available tomorrow.
Jotting that down on my paper pad.
Excellent. All right, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.